below the surface of a giant ice cap, a city is buried.
Some very interesting disclosures were declassified about U.S. military installations in Greenland, which took place in the 1960s with the cooperation of Denmark and NATO.
This is the story of Camp Century, the city under ice.
While feeding European allies and the American people a highly publicized cover story about the triumphs over nature and building an underground city for research under the ice at Greenland's Camp Century,
the basic concept was simple. A system of 23 trenches would be dug into the ice cap and then covered with steel arches and snow. Branching off the main communication trench would be a series of lateral trenches housing complete research, laboratory and test facilities, modern living quarters and recreation areas, and a complex of support facilities.
The Pentagon kept its real activities a secret. Only later did the truth about top-secret Project Iceworm surface. The Pentagon was attempting to put in place mobile nuclear launching sites that would utilize thousands of miles of tunnels to station ICBMs from theoretically random positions, all without Denmark's knowledge or consent.
Later, an escape hatch would be placed at the end of a small wooden form for an emergency exit.
Were similar installations attempted in Antarctica? Like Greenland's Camp Century, Antarctica's McMurdo and Byrd stations also featured a nuclear reactor, as well as under-ice tunnels.
16 of these escape hatches were strategically located throughout the various tunnels.
The inconvenient fact is that the U.S. lied to its international allies about nuclear weapon sites in Greenland, so it's fair game to question whether they did the same in the seemingly peaceful and cooperative atmosphere of frigid ice and penguin research.
The same questions apply to Admiral Byrd's equally publicized Operation Icebox, a tentative plan to partner with private corporations and bury food surplus in Antarctica. Perhaps it was just another cover for building an extensive underground tunnel system. It was talked about in interviews and papers from the time, but seemingly never materialized. This diagram shows how they can effortlessly dig a continuous trench, then place shipping containers and rebury for long-term storage. The article advertised, quote, "We plan to bury a cache of 100 loaves of bread every year over the next 100 years. We won't be here to finish the experiment, but our great-grandchildren will. We could create a permanent icebox for our food surpluses in the Antarctic, save on storage, and contribute a great act of international goodwill." Again, Greenland may be a blueprint for what was attempted in Antarctica. It should also be noted that the 1961 Atomic Energy Commission had completed an extensive labyrinth of underground tunnels in the Nevada desert for the purposes of underground nuclear testing. The agency told the AP at the time, quote, "The tunnels are being constructed for any use deemed necessary if and when the administration decides to resume nuclear testing."
During Operation High Jump, an Arctic submarine laboratory was dispatched to Antarctica from a California naval base where it tested under-ice operations with great success. This was a pivotal moment for underwater and polar warfare. Prior to launch, Admiral Byrd contacted Dr. Waldo Lyon, the top naval warfare submarine guy at their San Diego base, to ask him if there was any research he wanted to do in conjunction with the expedition. Lyon asked to test a new submarine in the ice-filled waters, and so they did. This Antarctic deployment was the first major field trial for subarctic submarine conditions, with success leading to new capabilities such as breaking through ice to surface and launching a nuclear warhead from underwater in range of Cold War targets anywhere on the map. Moreover, thousands of men were deployed to DEW-line distant early warning stations in North Canada and Greenland, and to submarines and aircraft patrolling the Bering Sea and northern Arctic waters under training originally supervised by Admiral Byrd. No further military tests were ever admitted in Antarctica, despite a massive militarization on the ice. And what came of the breakthroughs in ice core drilling, ice melting cryobots, deep-sea sea lab experiments designed for Arctic waters, and the 500-meter depths of its continental shelf? All of this must have made Antarctica's frozen abyss more accessible. Yet has anything significant been found? Have any bases been constructed there using tunnel boring systems, utilizing natural caves or geothermal hotspots? It's a big continent, so it's a very intriguing and perhaps plausible maybe. Again, Greenland may be a blueprint for what was attempted in Antarctica.
Another little-known and underexplained role in Antarctica is that of NASA engineers, who sent units to train for conditions that might be found in space. Numerous press reports in the 50s and 60s made the point of comparing Antarctica's conditions to that of the Moon and Mars, cold, unforgiving, and remote. High-ranking officials, including Wernher von Braun, conducted special training missions there, including one to prepare for tunneled underground bases on the Moon, like the ones in Antarctica. Other NASA reports have remarked on the similar mountainous terrain. But did these training missions for space travel also double as an opportunity to upgrade and expand military bases under peaceful pretext in the region? Did NASA take advantage of the reclusive area as a secret launching base? How many rockets were being test-fired here? And what was the real purpose?
And in early fall 1963, there were claims made that a nuclear bomb was detonated on the Antarctic continent. But as it did not register fallout, it was believed to have been set off either in the upper atmosphere where previous tests had been conducted or underneath the ice sheet. But the news was smothered. Despite the fact that this August 1963 blast, or test, was detected 2 days before the U.S. and Russia signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the White House ordered the detection of the explosion to be kept quiet until after the Senate voted on ratifying the grand sweeping treaty. The DoD originally denied that any explosion took place, and even tried to pass it off as a natural phenomenon before later conceding that it had in fact happened. The U.S. quietly pointed fingers at the Soviet Union, and months before his assassination, JFK decided to call for inspections of Russian bases in Antarctica under the terms of the 1959 treaty. Though the U.S. military initially denied reports of a nuclear weapon being detected, the Navy quietly admitted that this was the case, immediately the day after Kennedy's assassination. We found it mentioned on page 12A, following page after page of detailed and emotional JFK assassination coverage. After that, the issue seemed to disappear from public view. Did the Russians, the United States, or a joint scientific venture between multiple countries set off a nuke in the upper atmosphere of the poles in order to create an artificial EMP or aurora effect? If they did, it may have been allowed under the Antarctic Treaty, if and only if it was purely for science, and all member states agreed. If so, whatever they found or tested has been kept entirely under wraps.
The absolute biggest secret of all in Antarctica is the electromagnetic energy that surrounds and saturates life on planet Earth. How, precisely, does the magnetic energy from the poles create and modify weather? Why are the poles frozen? Why a huge landmass at one pole and an open ring of ocean at the other? Could the poles shift suddenly, rapidly changing climate and destroying existing life? Could science engineer the artificial melting of the poles in order to extrapolate the riches and resources buried underneath? Scientists, Antarctic explorers, and military figures alike have discussed how weather is made and controlled at the South Pole, along with the accumulation of 90% of the world's ice and 60% of its freshwater reserves, which also controls oxygen content in the atmosphere. And Byrd, among others, has hinted at controlling the weather, something the Navy has always had a deep interest in. They established Camp Sky High, the first upper atmosphere VLF summer station on Antarctica at the base of the Antarctic Peninsula. It carried miles of wires spread out over the ice and sought to stimulate artificial auroral effects that would reciprocate with its conjugate radio site in Quebec, Canada.
Resembling a gigantic peeled orange, this Rowan dome was assembled from prefabricated curved sections. Inside, it contained special equipment used for recording weather conditions. Another building, unusual in its dimensions, was the Aurora Airglow Tower.
Skull and Bones journalist and op-ed extraordinaire William F. Buckley visited the South Pole and remarked on its use for weather control, interacting with scientists studying hydrodynamics of the Earth's core, as well as geomagnetic effects on weather.
Harry Wexler, the chief U.S. scientist who was experimenting with weather control, was put in charge of the International Geophysical Year in 1958. This was the same year that Harry Wexler saw his plans for bombarding the ionosphere with nuclear weapons undergo live tests in the Navy's 1958 Operation Argus. creating an artificial aurora burst hundreds of miles away at magnetic correlates from the firing positions.
The Earth itself is a magnet. It acts as a dipole surrounded by a field of magnetic force. We see that the magnetic field extends a great distance from the Earth. Any one of these field lines can be thought of as lying in a shell.
Advances in understanding the electromagnetic shield that protects the planet lent themselves to military attempts to manipulate the weather. The Navy confirmed that it could black out satellite and radio communications with high-altitude explosions, eventually creating an EMP. What were their plans at the South Pole? Wexler was deep into this weather manipulation stuff, and leading the 1957 to 58 International Geophysical Year as chief U.S. scientist is very telling of the research objects of Antarctica. In his papers, Wexler had detailed specific designs for planetary scale manipulation of the Earth's climate using short and long-term radiation and inducing artificial worldwide climate change. Another of his plans was to set off enough hydrogen bombs in the Arctic Circle to melt the ice and increase the world's temperature. Or conversely, Wexler proposed launching a fine powder into equatorial orbit to reduce the Earth's temperature with permanent Saturn-like rings. He also formulated a detailed plan for bombarding the atmosphere with chlorine or bromine and punching a hole in the stratospheric ozone layer, proven to work in military tests, only to oppose the same plan later. Wexler was on a working vacation at the elite Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute with which he was affiliated when he died unexpectedly of a heart attack in 1962 at the young age of 51. Just months earlier, he gave a final speech to Woods Hole titled On the Possibilities of Climate Control, explaining the mechanisms not just to seed a few clouds, but to permanently control the Earth's climate. The terms of the 1959 Antarctic Treaty, barring military activities and preserving the world south of the 60-degree south latitude line for science, does not apply to U.S. Navy operations on the open seas. If any kind of atmospheric heater, HARP device, or SBX-1 radar device, or even a nuclear submarine is used to manipulate or alter weather offshore, there's no jurisdiction over its activities there outside of military doctrine and secret government control.
And then there's the totality of it all. Support for international scientific research trumps all other considerations in Antarctica. Or perhaps it has provided the ultimate cover for maintaining a massive, permanent, off-limits continent that is 1.5 times the size of the U.S., and within which they can run black projects away from the prying eyes of almost everyone else on the planet. Between the big push with Operation High Jump in 1946, where at least 190 Americans were left behind to continue operations, on through the next 15 years when the U.S. Navy and Air Force became the de facto custodians of the southern continent, the military took responsibility for at least 5 American permanent research stations with underground facilities, multiple atomic reactors, living quarters, and supply and transport for thousands of scientists around the continent. Great Britain had multiple expeditions to Antarctica during the late 1800s, the early 1900s, in World War I, and with classified operations during World War II, after which they never left, and their actions on the continent during that time are even less publicized.